Hi, everybody. Welcome to This Week in Global Development, where we discuss the key issues that are happening in the world of global development this week. Today, we've got with us Colum Lynch, who's a reporter at Devex, who specializes in the United Nations. And we're also joined by Tom Hart, President and CEO of Interaction, which is a membership body for all of the INGOs in the United States. Tom, very glad to have you both with us. Looking at what we're going to cover this week, we're going to kick off, I think, by talking about one of your stories, Colum, about the uncertainty facing the United Nations with the new Trump presidency. Do you want to tell us a little bit about kind of where you think the situation is at and what we should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's not entirely clear. They haven't completely assembled the team for the United Nations. I mean, the president has already named Elise Stefanik, a close political ally from New York. She has a brand as a kind of reputation as being very pro-Israel, against Palestinian aid, that sort of stuff. So that issue will be quite contentious, controversial. But in terms of, I think there is an expectation that this administration is going to impose significant cuts across the board on foreign aid, but it's not clear how deep it would go. And also, there was an expectation, there was an effort by the previous Trump administration to dramatically cut foreign assistance by up to 30%. They faced opposition from Republicans and Democrats in the Senate and the House. And so we're not able to achieve that. I mean, there is a sense that the Senate and the House will be more agreeable to cuts, but at the same time, they have to balance that with, to what degree do they want to create diplomatic space for the Chinese to fill, the U.S. When the U.S. withdraws from UN agencies, the Chinese often sees it as a kind of a distressed asset that it can purchase at a cheap price, and it can use it to try to pursue its own efforts to try and shape the global agenda. So I think there was a feeling that in the previous Trump administration, they weren't mindful enough of that. So that will play in terms of their calculations. But at this point, it's really unclear. Trump is unpredictable. They thought he was going to do more damage to the UN than he was. He actually liked the UN. He used to come here every year. He would sit with the Secretary General. He would preside over meetings. He liked the pageantry of the place. He invited the Security Council and the Secretary General to the White House for sit downs with him, something that President Biden never did. So I think the phrase uncertainty is really kind of where everybody is right now.
Sure. It's extremely hard to predict anything that Trump will do. I think this is the only thing that we all know for sure.
Yeah.
Tom, what are you kind of looking out for here? Um, what do you think is kind of the key factors we should be considering?
Yeah, well, I really agree with Colum in that there are a lot of inherent tensions in all we can look at is the first Trump administration and what has been said by himself and key allies going into the election and since. And look, there's some inherent tension between disengaging from international affairs and competing with China. There's an inherent tension between, we've seen some Trump support around localization, try to move our work more to the local level. There's some tension between that and massively cutting the budget and the bureaucracy in the U.S. to make sure that that assistance goes to where it needs to go and is it bringing the results that taxpayers demand. So again, I largely agree that it is impossible to predict what would happen. We would expect, as Colin just said, proposals for sharp cuts, particularly to the United Nations and other multilateral programs, to aid overall. And but again, I think we will see that will start a conversation, in our view, starting a conversation from a difficult place, but a conversation about what are the interests that we in this administration are trying to pursue, whether that's greater international stability and prevention of conflict. We know that's an objective. Well, we also know that food insecurity is one of the main drivers of conflict around the world. And we know that disease prevention is a priority. We know that, influence of America around the world is an interest to this president. And I rarely have seen a president want a smaller foreign policy toolbox, frankly, as he, and they all have been he, engage around the world. So again, I think it's going to be difficult. I don't want to look at this through rose-colored glasses, but I also would not predict the worst potential results based on early rhetoric.
Can I ask Tom a question, if you don't mind? What I'm really curious about, I mean, you're at the center of kind of development, humanitarian response, that sort of thing. Are you having conversations with the Trump administration, with the transition? We reported that Cartwright Weiland is heading the USAID transition. I mean, is he or his team, are they engaging with traditional development humanitarian organizations in Washington? And does
So
that
we've
and does
had
that differ from the Biden administration? Yeah.
Yeah. So the interaction has been limited so far. The transition teams are relatively new, and actually they're just figuring out the USAID. There obviously has not been a USAID administrator named yet. There have been informal conversations with our community with folks who are actively engaged with the transition, either as advisors or informally, or those who potentially are seeking roles in the new administration. Those conversations are active and have been honestly ongoing over the past 8 years. It is a community with good ideas and good relationships, and we will, continue to engage as we move forward. But it hasn't been as formalized as I think you're suggesting.
Right.
Do you think is that if we look back at the previous two administrations, the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, how different do you see it being from either of those?
Um, I mean, the Biden administration was much more actively reaching out and soliciting proposals around these areas than either the first or the current incoming Trump administration. That doesn't surprise me. I would say the doors are not closed, but it is just they are focused on other things. Again, we don't have an administrator nominee named, and I think they are figuring out just what level of priority. And again, this was not something that they campaigned on or have talked a lot about. So I'm not surprised that the early focus has been has been on other areas.
Colum, what do you think? Like, how much can we take the first Trump administration and use it as a guide for the second time round? Are the same factors in place? Does he have much greater control of Congress, much greater control of all of the different levers? Does the fact that he doesn't have to seek re-election make a difference? Do we think is that going to make people care less about what Trump thinks?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. The first Trump administration really, I mean, the president hasn't spoken a lot about what his plans are for international development, for the UN, and so on during the campaign. So the only way you can kind of put together a kind of roadmap is to look at what he did before and to look at the Heritage's Project 2025 program, which kind of outlines some of the proposals coming from within the sort of MAGA movement. And during the campaign, President Trump sort of disavowed the project, saying that it was not sort of part of his plan. But a lot of the people who were associated with it have been sort of recruited into the new Trump transition process. So I think those offer a good sort of key to what they want. I mean, the policies will be more transactional, I think, than what we've seen before. I think that there will be more of a focus on pursuing national security interests over humanitarian principles. I think that a number of other areas where you will see a preference for, for private sector sort of solutions rather than humanitarian solutions. You will see clearly, a withdrawal from the Paris Peace Agreement, from the climate agreement again. Zeroing out funding to the UN Population Fund. UN Women will take a hit. Still to be seen whether we will withdraw from UNESCO again, from the World Health Organization. But, there are big, aid agencies like UNICEF, WFP, UNHCR, International Organization of Migration, where the US has had, quite good relations with those organizations. I mean, the MAGA movement has been quite critical of IOM UNHCR, but I think that WP, UNICEF, those are traditionally American-led organizations, and I don't see this administration sort of walking away from those organizations. I think it's going to be kind of complicated. So on those fronts, still quite a bit of uncertainty. The UN Security Council is still going to be absolutely important. They will want to demonstrate leadership. They will want to show that they can bring the rest of the world along with them. So I think they will still want to engage in that theater.
Okay. Yeah, it just feels very hard to tell, doesn't it? Like it's not very helpful to sit here on a podcast and shrug and say, well, we really don't know. The guy could do anything. But that is very much the situation that we find ourselves in. One thing which we have seen already is that cuts have come in Europe. And the last year, in particular, we've seen a number of European governments making significant cuts to foreign aid. We um, we saw it a couple of years ago in my own country, the United Kingdom. For once, we got out ahead of everybody and started cutting foreign aid um, before it was fashionable. Normally, the UK likes to trail along a little bit behind in the United States, but there we go. We got out in front on this one. And now we're very much seeing right-wing governments in Germany and France and Italy and the European Union itself, some of the smaller countries, making significant cuts. This is potentially a worry because Europe has historically been a much more generous donor than the United States, or at least I'm a little bit skeptical about some of these figures. I think the United States is not too bothered about maximizing its aid impact, whereas European countries have tended to report every single kind of jot and tittle, and therefore we've seen Europe trying to make itself look more generous, while the United States haven't cared that much. But I wondered, like, how much, firstly, how worried are you, Tom, about kind of what's happening in Europe? And secondly, how much do you think we can read across from that to what's going to happen, the policies that are going to be adopted in the United States?
Yeah, no, I'm very worried about it. You're absolutely right. I mean, the European Union itself cut $2 billion. Germany cut $1 billion from development and $1 billion from humanitarian. France, the same. You're seeing it across traditionally proportionally generous countries like in Scandinavia cutting back. And it's not just right-wing governments. Let's be clear. The governments of Germany and France and the UK have done it, with support from multi-parties and under liberal governments. So, obviously with pressure, with rising populism and from their voters in those countries, but you can't draw a straight line between a new government coming in and cuts in aid. It is happening under purported friends of foreign assistance. So it is really concerning. One of the comfort I think the international community took in anticipation of the Trump administration coming in the first term was that, okay, well, other countries can step up to fill some of the voids. If that theory of the case tries to be applied this time, I think folks are going to be very, very disappointed because we have, in many respects, we're seeing that stepping back from foreign assistance, development and humanitarian assistance come before the next Trump administration. And so a step back by the largest donor, the United States, will create a hole that is not easily filled. Now, look, my job here is both to be concerned, but also to find those kernels of opportunity. And during the first Trump administration, foreign assistance actually was held constant. It actually a little higher when you count supplementals. PEPFAR was reauthorized. The Global Fragility Act was passed. The DFC was created. There was an opportunity in a different kind of frame, the journey to self-reliance, which former Administrator Mark Green under Trump really pushed to very good effect. And many of those policies have been continued under the Biden administration and ought to be continued now. I think there is opportunity to make headway and to blunt or translate some of this harsh rhetoric into reforms, into changes, into demands that there be a greater burden sharing among other donors. And we should look to other regions beyond just Western Europe to step up in support of foreign assistance around the world and for longer sustainable development from partner countries themselves. So those are the hooks that we're going to be looking toward moving forward.
Just to follow up, I'm sort of curious about the impact on sort of basic geopolitics of what we're seeing in terms of the aid cuts. I mean, the UN and other international meetings, conferences, G20, et cetera, the COP meetings, they're all focused on this notion of whether there is a trade-off with the global South over financing for climate mitigation, for pandemic relief, health issues, debt relief. And all the conversations in New York are sort of focused on this, on reform of the international financial architecture. We're moving in another direction, and that has implications for relations, particularly in the global South. I mean, in the sort of fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a big effort by the Europeans and the Americans to draw the global South behind them to create a broader international coalition against Russia's decision to invade a UN member state. That has kind of weakened, and a lot of that has to do with a lack of trust in the North's willingness to sort of pay more for climate implications and that sort of stuff. So it seems like we're moving into a direction that's likely to exacerbate those tensions. And I'd be curious, Tom, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, not many thoughts other than to agree with your broad assertion that it is going to continue to be amplified and difficult with our relations and to begin to bridge those gaps. I mean, it's no wonder that the global South, which has contributed the least to carbon emissions and, particularly in Africa, which is suffering the worst consequences, is saying, we need some help with this transition and for resilience and for adaptation. It is not surprising that the United States and other Western donors countries at a time of greater austerity and rising populism are saying, no, our ability to respond to this is going to be more limited. So, and then you have China with a very clear global strategy to engage. The Belt and Road Initiative is a clear self-interested play by the Chinese, both for access routes, trade, raw minerals, and relationships. And I guess the United States and traditional donors are going to have to make a decision about whether we're going to compete on that playing field or not. If we take our toy, China would like nothing more than for the United States to take its toys and go home. That would be a big win for them in the multilaterals and in the global donor space. I don't think that's what the United States or incoming President Trump will want to do. How we engage will certainly have a different flavor than the Biden administration and others.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
You go.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm curious, I had a conversation with Jeremy Konindick at Refugees International last week, and we were talking about the idea of like who fills the gap if the U.S. pulls out, particularly humanitarian aid, but not just humanitarian aid, across the board development assistance. And you have big philanthropy organizations, in the climate and the health space. But more broadly, I mean, is there really any way to incentivize philanthropy to play a broader role in this space? And also, everybody kind of has been talking about the private sector. Is there really a mechanism for getting the private sector more engaged? I mean, really, is there any one, are these organizations going to be able to fill the gap of governments pulling back, or is that just not going to happen?
Philanthropies have done an incredible amount but I think there is no replacing the scale of governments, particularly the U.S. government. You could empty Bill Gates and Oprah's and all the foundation's coffers and still not match what the United States government does in terms of its scale and depth of resources, as well as its diplomatic influence in those policies. You're correct that philanthropies have traditionally not invested as much in humanitarian. Frankly, the American public is the most generous on the planet with humanitarian. The organizations represented by Interaction raise between $8 and $10 billion annually from American citizens. to respond to humanitarian and development needs around the world. 8 to 10 billion. That puts the American citizens on par with most G7 countries. And then, of course, then it's matched by the US government. So it's actually one of the greatest sort of public-private partnerships out there. But if the US government goes away, if that half of that equation leaves, there's going to be massive suffering and a huge gap left that the American public, through its generosity, is not going to make up. And while philanthropies could certainly do some, the Gates Foundation often contributes to certain international multilaterals as much and or more than many countries. They're not going to make up for that very large gap of the United States.
Yeah, I think that's right. We can't expect any. We're looking at 5 to 10% of development funding coming from philanthropies at the moment, and probably a similar amount from publics around the world. And I just that could double, and it wouldn't have any impact really if the geopolitical will is pushing us in the opposite direction. I do want to pick up on a couple of your points just there quickly. One is I think we can all agree that climate finance is probably the worst, or just about the worst, of all types of funding that goes on out there. I don't know quite why it is so uniquely bad, but I think we have to identify that there are so many flaws, so many complaints about the nature of climate finance. And we published some one campaign research, or we referred to some one campaign research that came out late last year, in the last couple of days, which said that governments actually spend 6 times as much on fossil fuel subsidies as they did on climate finance. And a lot of that climate finance is very low quality. It's loans, it's not grants, it's not really going to the right place. It's often for things that the climate impact is very, very debatable. A couple of things I wanted to pick up on. One is I was really interested in to read about last year's G20, and really it seemed like there the Global South was really flexing its muscles and trying to push back to have much more of a dialogue and try and actually kind of win some concessions from the North, turning it into much more of a kind of debate. And also the Summit of the Future, a lot of the stuff that happened there, the arm wrestling around the impact of how the Security Council was constituted, all of that stuff. Obviously, Trump is going to significantly reduce that whole agenda. But Colum, do you see that as a kind of growing process, that the Global South is going to kind of try and put its foot down a bit more on issues like climate and debt, and with more success?
Well, I don't know. I mean, put their foot down. I mean, I think that, I don't know that you can do that, but I think that it's going to be a source of enormous tension. I mean, we're already seeing kind of backsliding on climate issues. Like, you had the latest COP, meeting. There was no reference to the need to transition away from fossil fuels, which is something that was in the agreement at the Summit of the Future. So the question of whether, a very transactional kind of administration is going to feel inclined to support, more funding for the Global South, or to accept even the notion that the North bears responsibility for the climate crisis. I mean, this is a president who has called climate change a hoax. So I think that, I don't think they're going to be inclined to make concessions to the Global South over, financial reform, or reform of the financial sort of architecture. And I don't think that there's going to be a lot of movement in that area. And I think it's just going to build up this tension between the North and the South. And it's going to make it harder for the US to maintain backing. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, during the first Trump administration, the Chinese backed a candidate for the Chinese candidate for the head of the FAO, right? And the US backed a Georgian candidate and tried to rally support from, the Global South, from their European partners in Rome over the FAO. And they got their clocks clean. I mean, the Chinese just, they basically carried most of the Africans. They completely ran circles around the United States. And, in international institutions, the Africans have numbers, the Global South has big numbers. And so it's important, if you want not to be seen as totally isolated, if you don't want to lose these battles for positions within the broader UN system, that you maintain, a decent relationship with these governments. And so, the issue about funding for development, for health, for debt relief, all these are seen by people in the global south as part of the bargain. And I think there's going to be less of a feeling to try to pretend that that the U.S. is going to be willing to strike that bargain.
Okay. I'd love to continue that conversation. We have to go in a couple of minutes, I believe. Tom, you've got a hard stop. I wanted to ask you very briefly about a piece that was written this week saying that, talking about localization, saying that for the last few years we've seen rising funding, albeit slowly, for localization, and that the Trump administration has a real opportunity for that to continue, and there seems to be a certain amount of optimism that the Trump administration will continue it. How optimistic should we be about that?
I'm going to harken back to an earlier theme of this conversation, which is predicting the future is a hazardous occupation. There is a lot of talk on both sides of the aisle. Project 2025, the chapter on USAID, leaned in on localization. We've heard this across both. There's both sides of the aisle. There's bipartisan legislation on localization. As I mentioned, the journey to self-reliance under Trump 1 continued and expanded under the Biden administration to have actually a hard target of 25% of funding be done through local partners. Wildly missed by the administration, but I want to give them credit for setting the target and being transparent about where we are and how much work there needs to be. Look, I think it could be a real opportunity to transform. Transform is too bold a statement. To really improve the system where it can work. It is too much money stays within inside the Beltway and directed from outside of local communities who know what they need and know how to drive and prioritize and implement programs. If localization from a second Trump administration is simply an excuse to cut funding, I fear it's going to fail at its start. If it is an authentic effort to try to drive decision-making, local ownership to community and faith-based organizations at the local level, it's going to be a hard shift for the current system, but the international NGOs represented by Interaction embrace that change and really hope that we could make a difference.
Can I sneak in just a last follow-up on that very quickly? Faith-based organizations. So in Project 2025 and also in the previous administration, there was really a focus to try and kind of broaden their role, expand their role in the delivery of humanitarian or development assistance, humanitarian assistance. And that seems to be a very strong, theme that goes through the Project 2025. I mean, are you seeing that there's going to be a big shift and that there's going to be a much bigger role for faith-based organizations? And within your own organization, your constituents, are you finding that that people from these groups, from these organizations, have a closer relationship with the incoming team and that they have been able to, in some ways, help you guys understand what's going on?
Yeah, I do expect a greater emphasis on working with faith-based organizations in a Trump administration, particularly Christian organizations. Interaction represents many different faiths. About a third of our membership are organizations that consider themselves faith-based. And yes, they do. They are having active conversations, as I understand it, what they are capable of doing. Look, you can't do work in around the developing world without working with the faith-based community. That is where so much education and healthcare provision is made. And there are very few institutions that draw people together once a week. The faith community does that. And so it's an incredibly important piece of the development and humanitarian response puzzle. So I expect that will be on the ascent.
Great, thanks.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you both very much. This has been a great discussion as always. And to all of our listeners, thank you very much for listening to This Week in Global Development, and we hope we'll see you same time next week. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, all.
Thanks.